Perfect. The first announcement I have is about our publication with Sober Senses. On June 2nd, we published an article by Ralph Keller, The Struggle Against Digital Schwang. I hope I'm probably not pronouncing that properly. He discusses digital schwang, the increasing tendency of governments and corporations to force people into a digital and online life that comes with a mandatory provision of personal data, as well as the risks and increasing resistance. He then connects digital schwang with Marx's theory of alienated labor and suggests future ways to push back while also achieving the aim of protecting children without surrendering civil liberties. And I just have another little announcement about our publication too. After this meeting, if anyone is interested in MHI, I encourage you to read our statement of principles and our bylaws on the website. If you're interested in reading about what makes MHI different than other Marxist organizations, I encourage you to read an article we published in March titled "Why Join MHI?" and appeal to the readers of With Sober Senses. We also released a podcast episode discussing this article on May 8th. And I have an announcement about Radio Free Humanity. We released 2 episodes since May 8th. Both are parts 1 and 2 of a discussion called Marxism and the Philosophy of Science. Gabriel and Andrew, who are the co-hosts of Radio Free Humanity, have political scientists David Bedford and W. Tom Workman on the show to discuss their book, Marx, Engels, and the Philosophy of Science. The conversation centers on how science is increasingly under attack in the age of post-truth and how science and the philosophy of science are relevant to Marxism. And my final announcement is that we hope to send out a letter to our mailing list soon about our upcoming meetings and other information pertinent to supporters and friends. If you would like to be on this mailing list, please write to MHI@Marxist-Humanist-Initiative.org. And now just a couple general Zoom procedures. As you can tell, everyone is muted by default. We're going to ask you to use the raise hand button and the chair will unmute you. Click the hand button again after you were called on to lower it. And I'll post the procedures for raising your hand in the chat, but on most devices, you go down to the bottom and click more, and there will be a raise hand button there, or there will be a button that says reactions, and then in the reactions, you can raise your hand. If you're on a Windows or Mac, the Zoom website says you can use Alt-Y to raise and lower your hand, and on a Mac, Option Y to raise and lower your hand. If you're having problems with this, just write in the chat. And a couple more things. If someone tells you that you're difficult to hear, one of the chairs might tell you that we can't hear you or your microphone is murky. Just try getting further away or closer to the mic until we tell you it's clear. There will be no speaking from the floor during the first half unless the chair needs to know something urgently. Then type that in the chat and the chair will unmute you. And again, do not use the chat except to report a problem with sound, or you or the meeting is in danger, or the chair needs to know something urgently. If you can't get through about a hearing or speaking issue over the chat, send an email to the MHI mail or to mhi.org.canada@gmail.com. Yeah, I think that's everything. So I'm going to hand the meeting over to Ralph to open up the Q&A session conversation between Andrew and Ante.
Yeah, just to reiterate, if anybody has something that I should be aware of as a matter of, well, that's urgent or that I really need to be aware of, please raise your hands and I'll unmute you. Other than that, I'm now handing over to Ante and
Ralph,
Andy. Yeah,
the chat needs to be enabled.
chat needs to be enabled.
I'm enabling it now. No worries, Ralph. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, over to you. Please go ahead, Andrew and Ante.
Ante, you're going first.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to see you all and very pleased for this wonderful opportunity. So yes, I'm just going to be brief and briefly. We have a lot of questions and we should get to the meat of the meeting as soon as possible. So without any further ado, I'll just say that the general idea of this meeting is to discuss the economics of the lower phase of communism. And maybe you've seen some of these pre-prepared questions that I've had. Uh, they came about through the conversation with Andrew, and we are trying to recreate in a more illuminating form some of the problems and some of the discussions we had. So that's what we're aiming to do, and then we'll have Q&A for all the different other questions. And we'll go one by one, but maybe I'll rephrase some of the questions, the ones that are a tad longer and so on. So I'll just start with the first one, which would be a methodological question, a bit of setting of the stage, so to speak. Given that we're going to talk about post-capitalist future, if there going to be any, how are we able to do that without running afoul of that famous injunction from Marx not to engage in utopian thinking? More specifically, Andrew, you're writing a book now about what would, to some extent, be post-capitalist economy and what would merit the name of the communist/socialist economic system mode of production different from the capitalist one. And now, how can we talk about that, given, everyone can throw in our faces that famous quote from one of Marx's prefaces to the volume 1 of Capital: "I'm not here to write recipes for the cookshops of the future," and so on. So what we're going to do now is not engaging in scribbling over and squabbling over recipes for future. How is that different, and how is that something that Marx himself engaged in, actually, despite famous press saying he didn't? Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I'm really pleased to have this conversation and for you to have contacted me and asked a bunch of questions and I answer and you respond. It's been very good. This might work its way into the book. The book is about Marx's conception of socialist or communist society. He used those terms interchangeably. And what about capitalist society needs to be changed in order for there to be a transformation of capitalism into socialism. Now, the first thing is that these terms have meaning. Capitalism, socialism. There's certain things implicit in the concepts themselves. And there's certain other things implicit in the relations when we speak about transformation. And the way I understand it, drawing out the implications of concepts is not drawing up a blueprint, a recipe for the cookshops of the future, writing code for the ticket masters of the future. Drawing out implications tells us what's possible, what's necessary, what's impossible. But at the end of that, you're going to rule out what's impossible, say, okay, we got to do what's necessary, but then there's a lot of things that are possible, but they don't necessarily have to be. So multiple things are possible, and choosing from among those possibilities involves subjectivity, blueprints, picture thinking, where you get a mental image of what it is that you're talking about. And Marx avoided that kind of stuff. He did offer a picture of workers receiving certificates that say that they're entitled to means of consumption. And that picture has unfortunately attracted people's attention and created a lot of confusion. And we'll be talking about that. But for the most part, Marx avoided picture thinking. And the problem with picture thinking is, let's say it's a dog. You say, well, concept is dog. The moment you get a mental picture, it's of a specific dog. And that just rules out in your picture all of the other possibilities, so you're thinking of, Fido, my neighbor's dog who's white, right, and pees on the this and that. But that's not like what a dog is. That's a specific thing, and you've gotten too specific for what is demanded at that moment. You're introducing your own choices, your own subjectivity. Your picture is just one of many possibilities. And I think that the reason people get this idea that Marx didn't talk much about socialism is, first of all, they don't know his work all that well. He did say a lot of things. But in addition, they're looking for a picture. They're looking for a proposal. They're looking for Marx to advocate something specific. But his method was very different from that. He's focused on what's necessary, what's impossible, and then what is possible. And I think this focus on proposals and advocacy has its root in a political determinist orientation. The idea that basically anything we want is possible, we just need to make it happen politically. We decide what we want, we decide how we can implement it, and then we go ahead and implement it. But what if it's impossible? What if your implementation has unanticipated consequences? So those are some of the problems of the political determinist way of thinking. And it's just all around us, though. So people who have that kind of orientation just don't even see it when Marx is, in fact, directly or indirectly speaking about the new society.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what we're going to do now is try to draw out some of the implications. And one of the recommended readings that we have for this this meeting today was first part of the Marx critique of the Gotha program, and then your article, which really illuminated many of the aspects of that very theoretically dense and incredibly important text that Marx wrote, not published during his lifetime, and so on. And in that, he actually specifies 4 things which you draw out then and zone in on, which would be different between capitalist and communist mode of production. And these 4 somewhat familiar, but they would be, once we actually number them, that this would be common ownership of the means of production. Okay, that's one thing which would be completely different, but that's not enough by itself. Then we have second thing, the producers do not exchange their products. We'll come to that. There will not be a sphere of exchange as we know it now. Okay, the third thing, the labor employed on the products does not appear anymore as the value of these products. Okay, so we don't have commodity production insofar as commodities use value plus value as distinct from its use value and all the rest. So we don't have commodity producers and commodity production. And the fourth thing, directly social labor. And we're gonna start with this one, with directly social labor. What would that mean? I'm doing my work for an hour. That would be directly social if people said to me that I should work that, if we all agree on it, that that's valuable work, valuable in a colloquial sense of something which is worthwhile and not in a specific sense connected with capitalist mode of production. Okay, we have that work. And then does that mean that every hour of work, regardless of the job we are doing, would be equal to one another? 1 hour of work of surgeon would be equal to the 1 hour's work of me trying to ask you these questions, and that would be some kind of, let's say, journalistic work. So in that sense, directly social labor, does that mean that? What would directly social labor in fact be?
Okay, let me start at the beginning. I mean, basically, most of our labor nowadays is social labor. It's not only for ourselves and our households and, people immediately around us. We're really producing, in some sense, for a whole of society, people we've never met and so forth. So all labor is social, or almost all labor is social. But in a commodity producing society, and the only real ones, societies that produce commodities are capitalist economies, the labor is social, but it's not directly social. An act of labor, let's say an hour of labor, does not immediately or directly qualify as an hour of social labor. First of all, it has to produce something that's useful for others. And that can't always be known in advance because tastes change, demand changes. And it's only recognized socially, it qualifies as labor to the extent that the labor is socially necessary. So if excess amount of effort is put into it, or you're slow, not all of the labor counts as labor. So what is used to measure how much labor you're doing is not how many hours and how much effort you put into it, but the value of the things that you're producing and the quantity of the products that you're producing. So the products and the value are intermediaries. They mediate whether the physical act of labor qualifies as social labor. There are additional conditions. And what Marx is saying is in communist society, labor will be directly social. So it's not going to be mediated through value, having to produce, according to socially necessary labor time. There's no exchange of products. So the productivity of an individual is not a barrier. It's not you don't have to qualify in terms of a certain level of productivity for your labor to count and so forth. So yes, you do an hour of labor, it counts as an hour of labor. It's directly social. Okay, it's not an hour of labor and if this and if that and then no, it's an hour of labor, it's an hour of labor with one qualification. Not all hours of labor are the same in terms of how much work is done. And I'm not talking about productivity. I'm talking about how much work you actually do. So let me take a case of somebody tending a machine, and now they're tending two machines. So they're doing in the same hour double the amount of work. Or you take two different jobs. Somebody is a guard at night. That's a low intensity job. Somebody is an air traffic controller. Their eyes and mind have to be on the screens all the time. That's a very high intensity job. So I would say, I think most of us would agree that the work of the air traffic controller is more intense. And given, let's say, 1 hour of work, they're actually doing a lot more work than somebody who's just standing guard at night.
Yeah, that would definitely make sense because once I read for the first version of this, I think it was from 2009 or something with Sober Senses on MHI site. The thing that I didn't initially understand with this directly social labor, 1 hour of labor would count the same whatever else you do. If we all in advance agree that that's a socially useful labor that we should be doing, that was the part that really troubled me because of the perverse incentive to just all of us do the work, which would be much less intense and get a lot of possibilities for consumption. We'll get to that with labor certificates and so on. But yeah, you can do 10 hours of work in much less intense job and be able to consume then, and that would be the next step, much more products than if you do air traffic control, which you shouldn't be able to do legally or in whatever way we stipulate that, but for more than 5 or 6 hours just because of the intensity of it. But what you're saying is actually that intensity counts and that wouldn't be a problem. But do you think there's a method either existing right now or something that can be devised of actually enumerating all the different jobs that we could be doing and then seeing the level of intensity which every job should be able to, that we should assign to each and every job that we ought to be doing in this future society?
Yeah, I think the intensity of different jobs can be assessed in a certain sense. You could say it could be measured, not directly. You might be able to do some stuff to measure, how much energy is expended by a person. But, in the case of air traffic control, it's a very intense job, but it's not, the intensity is not going to be recorded by such an instrument. I think, we'll have to measure indirectly, in a rough way, kind of the way in which doctors, at least in the United States, measure levels of pain. They have a chart up on the wall with little faces and smiling faces and faces that are all contorted with numbers. And they go, what's your level of pain? Oh, well, it's about an 8. Okay, so it goes like from 0 to 10. So 8's pretty bad. So I think, we can gauge intensity in that kind of way.
Okay, and that would actually be very important for us to, again, not create this perverse incentive of doing much easier work and everyone just being interested in doing that to get the means of consumption through that way, without wanting to engage with very hard job like emergency services or whatever else, which is just very intense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That makes
the point to recognize is that when that the more intense labor is actually more labor, and the tending 2 machines instead of tending 1 machine, that's the simplest kind of example. You can see it's actually double the amount of work that's being done.
But what shouldn't be criteria is, for example, seniority. Someone is just on the job for much longer than someone else, and that's why they're entitled, because they have bigger responsibility to more proceeds for
Right.
their
There's
hourly labor to come
seniority
more.
and responsibility. They might be new, but I have a very responsible job. I have to manage. I have to think. Yeah, but you're still doing an hour of work, and it's not all that intense. Okay, so we're happy that you're willing to take on this responsibility, but you're doing an hour of work.
Okay, yeah, that would definitely make sense. Okay, we can maybe proceed to another question. That would be the 4th one, and that's again coming back to the critique of the Gotha program. There's this Ferdinand Lassalle's phrase that the undiminished proceeds of labor, which Marx takes to task and critiques and so on. And there he talks about deductions, necessary deductions from these supposed undiminished proceeds of labor that should be given to every worker in this socialist economy. So what would be these deductions? What's the point of these deductions?
Right. Okay, there are 2 basic places where Marx mentions the deductions, and I'll go to the first one. He is bringing this up in order to criticize the draft Gotha program for this phrase, undiminished proceeds of labor. And he says, look, they've got to be diminished. And I think his point is the program is just engaging in rhetorical hot air. It's not thinking realistically about the problems that it's supposedly talking about. So in that context, he says, okay, the proceeds of labor might mean the value. It might mean the physical amount of stuff. Let's say it means the products, the physical amount of stuff. Here's why here's why the total social product doesn't just flow to, the workers and they divvy it up amongst themselves. Okay, a lot of reasons why. First of all, some of the total social product is there. It already exists. It's a question of where does it go? Where is it destined to? First of all, some of it has to replace means of production that have just been used up. You've produced this stuff with means of production. You got to replace the used up means of production. And nobody's going to eat a machine anyway. Okay. Second of all, some of the total social product you want to probably invest for expansion of production. And then there's all kinds of calamities, emergencies. You need reserve funds. You need an insurance. So, if you've got flooding somewhere or wherever, you need products, you need means of production to fill those tasks of, insurance against accidents and calamities. Then he says, okay, well, there's government administration. It doesn't say government, but it's government administration. Okay, that has to take place. The society needs to, function. So you need some of those products, buildings, computers, whatever it would be. And the people who are involved in government administration, they have to, eat and so forth like everybody else. Okay. And then you've got collective consumption. You've got roads, you've got parks, maybe schools, and so forth and so on. And so individuals don't appropriate those things as individuals. And then there are all kinds of people who can't work. They're too young, they're ill, they're too old. Okay, they need to be provided for as well. So this is like similar to welfare spending that we have nowadays. Once you've gotten rid of all of that, only then do you come to the means of consumption that are available to be divided among the people who've done, the actual work in the latest period. So that's the deductions. It's a question of the total social product in existence at a moment and how it gets divvied up into various functions, various destinations. And the overall point is just, if you're going to talk realistically at all about, proceeds of labor, you have to talk about it, in these concrete terms and not undiminished and other phrases that are just ideological.
What initially troubled me with this version of the deductions is this thing, cost of administration. I took that to mean that people who are doing administration, their work is not directly social because their costs need to be covered. But in fact, it's only total social product insofar we have physical things, for example, as you mentioned, computers and so on. And not all of them can go back to workers who created those computers, for example, or equivalent in labor time or whatever, but you need actually someone who will use that for some other reasons. But that doesn't mean that administration jobs, for example, are not directly social like all the other jobs that they need to be covered through these deductions. Is that right?
Yeah, I was kind of surprised that you were focusing on something in addition to the total social product and its distribution. And that's all he's referring to at that point is the total social product and its distribution. He's not talking, it's not a plan for the organization of production. It's not a way of assessing the contribution of any individual. It's just, here's the stuff, where does it go?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean,
Ante, bearing in mind that we have a part 2 coming of this meeting, could you perhaps focus a bit more on the essentials of each question?
Sure. We'll move it up now. Okay, so now we have 5th and 6th question, which are sort of connected to some extent, and they have to do with this famous thing about the lower versus higher phase of communism. In higher phase, there's from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs, and the link between what you contribute to society and what you can get back from it is severed, doesn't have to exist anymore. But in lower phase of communism, which is still stamped with the birthmarks from bourgeoisie mentality and so on, as Marx says, there people will actually have to contribute to society and they can get back what they contribute through that, let's say, labor certificates. This is the amount of work I did, and I can retrieve from common consumption funds things which are worth that much. However, we determine the cost, to which will also come back later. So what happens with the sphere of exchange in communism? Does that mean that there's no exchange in communism, or that that's the only place where exchange happens between society and the individuals when they do the work?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's the latter. As you already quoted Marx, there will be no exchange of products. Products aren't going to belong to individuals as individuals, except for their own means of consumption. Your toothbrush, your hairbrush, the meal in front of you. That belongs to you. But apart from those consumption items, nobody owns products. So there's no exchange of products. There's still an exchange in a different sense. Marx says it's an exchange of labor. In other words, you work and you get back from society products that have taken labor. So there's this indirect exchange of labor, but no exchange of products.
Okay, so yeah, the example was that when I come to the coffee shop, cafe, whatever, and I get a cup of coffee and I use these labor certificates or whatever, I thought that this would constitute exchange even in a lower phase of communism, and that labor certificate, something which actually says that I'm doing the work, that I've done the work, would be a medium of exchange. But you said no, because of all of these reasons, exchange happens before, and this is just a unit of account and problem of accounting. Nothing actually happens economically in that sense.
Yeah, there's two different things there. First of all, a medium of exchange is a technical term in economics, and it was prior to Marx writing. And we're referring to exchange of products. When we refer to medium of exchange, we're talking about exchange of products. And what a medium of exchange is an asset that is accepted in exchange. Okay, so if you trade corn for linen, the corn is a medium of exchange to get the linen, and vice versa. In reality, there is one generally accepted medium of exchange called money. Okay, generally accepted means universally. You can use money to get this, that, the other thing. And nothing else serves as a general or universal medium of exchange. You can't take linen, you can't take corn, you can't take pens, and just use them to get whatever else you want. You first have to get money. So basically, there is a medium of exchange, one universal medium of exchange. It's an asset, and it's used to obtain products. It's a way of purchasing. There's not going to be exchange of products for reasons we can get into. There's not going to be money. There's not going to be value. Okay, so there'll be exchange of labor for products of labor between the individual and society, but there's not going to be any medium of exchange, because all of that presupposes exchange of value, exchange of products, money, and so forth.
Okay, yeah. That makes sense, and that would be that simile with theater tickets, comparison with theater tickets, which again doesn't. Once you get a theater ticket, then you can go inside and see the play. That's not the economic exchange. Once you
we should get into that. Maybe not at this point, but that's not obvious to people.
Okay,
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
We have question number 7, which is a summation of what we talked about, and there would be 3 different moments that we were talking about here. One, as we already said, is exchange between the individual and society through directly social labor. Okay, that's what we covered to some extent. Second is this method to verify that the person who requests some consumption goods is actually entitled to that to those consumption goods. And okay, that's method to verify. We can talk about that, but that's a technical issue. We can see how to do that. And the third thing, which I thought would be exchange, but doesn't actually constitute exchange, would be this bookkeeping and tracking how much I can take. For example, if I get something worth 1 hour of labor, I can purchase, for example, things which are worth that hour of labor, number of products which are worth that. We'll come back to price formations or shadow price formations, and why labor costs would not be the only variable in that determination, and why that would be a problematic thing to say. But in this sense, we are talking now about labor notes / certificates, however we want to call it. And this is this thing that we have as a unit of accounting, as a bookkeeping. That's what enables me to go into the store, take things that I have to have, and then something is deducted. For example, I don't have 60 minutes anymore. Now I have 45, for example, because I spent it on something. Does that make sense? I mean, is that what would be the nuts and bolts of it, of this labor certificate?
I missed a lot of this because of bandwidth problems.
Sorry.
But let me just say about the theater ticket as an analogy. This is an analogy that Marx mentions in Capital. So you talked about the exchange, the verification, and the exercise and accounting of the consumption rights. What a theater ticket
We lost Andrew. He might come back in a sec. Let's give it a few seconds.
Can you hear me, Ralph?
On an exchange.
Yeah, I
Okay,
can
the
see.
exchange occurs as verification.
Sorry, Andrew. Yeah, Andrew.
Okay, I'm gonna move my position.
You cut out for a sec.
Right. I'm gonna move my position closer to the modem. It's about the best thing I can do right now. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm close to the modem. Yeah. So the theater ticket's not an exchange. It's what you get as verification after the exchange. When you walk to the entrance to the theater, away from the booth to the entrance, they need to verify who you are, and you hand over the ticket. That's your exercise of your right to enter the theater. Okay. So it's the same thing like in a communist society in its lower phase. You do the work, okay, and that gives you rights to consume. That's the exchange. Then you could get a certificate, you could do facial recognition, whatever, to verify that you're the person who's entitled. And then you withdraw a certain amount of certain kinds of stuff, and then you're exercising your consumption rights. And there's some app, some program that's recording that you've withdrawn this and that amount.
Yeah, that would be the question number 8, how specific we should be. And this is actually what you already demonstrated. We just need something which should conceptually fit this mold of what labor notes / verifications, certifications, whatever have to be. And as you said, that could be an app of sorts, like today with credit cards and many different ways of paying things. I mean, there are ways now, and there will be maybe even better ways in the future technologically to do this work of verification. But conceptually, what's needed is things that you've now mentioned, and that's what distinguishes it from means of exchange for money and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, kind of highfalutin to put, all these nouns and stuff and fancy words, verification, but you start talking about certificates, you're writing code for the ticket masters of the future. It doesn't have to be that way, and it's better to think about what the concepts are, because you're going to understand what's involved. When your head gets fixated on a picture of a certificate, with your name, calligraphy. Yeah, don't go there.
Yeah. And there's another thing that we discussed in our conversation, which I think now would be a good time to just bring this out. And that would be why it's problematic to call it labor certificate, something that labor entitles you to do. Obviously, that's what Marx says. But there are actually 2 ways to get these consumption rights, even in critique of the Gotha program. One is this famous one: you have to work quantum of labor that you give to society, society gives back to you. But there's another thing, and that's being a recipient of welfare. And we have that even now, as you said, older people or children or whatever. Or for example, if you're a working person and you're on parental leave, for example, and then why wouldn't those people, and I mean, Marx definitely wouldn't mind, at least as far as we can tell, why wouldn't those people get those labor certificates as well? So instead of calling it labor certificates, maybe, and especially because 1 hour of labor because of intensity can't just translate to 1 hour of something and that's how we're going to buy it, why just don't call it consumption rights and that's it? Consumption rights, which has some kind of numbers in it and which you then deduce once you spend it on something, and that would be, ideologically speaking, less fraught, less obsessed with the work as the best thing that we can actually do, even though it's important to work. But all this SSSR problems with works and workers being the most important and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. We've gone through these 2 moments, and we've gone through this verification, how that would work more or less. So now we are coming to the final few questions. And we're going to keep this brief to allow others to have Q&A and stuff like that. So another thing that we were talking about, once you get these consumption rights, is should we differentiate between some kinds of means of subsistence that you would be getting on a daily basis, for example, foodstuff and stuff like that, or something that it's actually quite possible for you to order in advance and know that you're going to need, for example, laptop, mobile phone, or whatever. And this is connected with participatory economy, Pericon, Michael Albert, Robin Hanel, and all the other guys who are doing and gals who are doing these plans for decentralized but still planned economy. So we were talking about that, and should we be in a position to always have a list of things that we want to consume, and should we be doing those lists, or is there some leeway between doing lists for everything we're going to consume, or some things that we can just presume are going to be consumed just because we need to live, and food stuff and stuff like that? Yeah.
Well, I think, to the extent that orders can be placed in advance, that makes the job of economic coordination of production, transportation of supplies, it makes it a lot easier. So to the extent that that's possible, that's good. To the extent that you can forecast what demands for different things are going to be, you can ease a lot of the problems that way. But times change, tastes change, and the problem is all of these products are produced with all kinds of means of production. Supplies, machinery, parts, and it comes from all kinds of different places. It's one gigantic world, interconnected system. So, it's like the butterfly effect, you consume a cup of coffee in Zagreb, and something's got to be happening thousands of miles away around the world to make that happen. So, certain things can be done to make the production and provision of these things go a little bit easier. Having lists helps. I mean, I assume that, for the most part, if a society is not really poor, you can have, certain reserve stocks. So if, David Schweikert wants an avocado, or some bacon, there is enough, in the stores so he can get his avocado and bacon when he wants. But as we saw with like the COVID pandemic, it doesn't even work, in a market society that way when push comes to shove. So the more information that you can have, the better. The less things will screw up. This idea, though, that whatever you want is going to be available when you want it, which seems to be the David Schweikert point of view, that doesn't even happen in modern, capitalism. And you can't have a planned economy where you have to be immediately responsive to every change in whim. And what that does is it enables people with a lot of money to get the avocados and the bacon that somebody else would have gotten, and you'll get your people to drive the bacon from the store, halfway across the city at the right price. And David Schweikert can get his bacon, and he's going to get his avocado, and he's happy. And but his idea that that's market socialism. The proletarians and peasants in China, believe me, are not getting all the bacon and avocados they want just whenever they want.
Sure. Okay. Now we can come to the penultimate question, and that would be something that we already alluded to, and that's how the cost of the product will be determined. Now we have socially direct labor. We get those labor certificates in whatever form, or consumption rights, better thing to say. But then the question is, what about the price? What we would call price? That would just be how much we'll lose of these units of consumption rights once we take them. And a question that I, given that you mentioned coffee, was particularly anxious to have it answered is difference between specialty coffee and regular coffee, because actually you can get regular coffee much cheaper even today, just because it's easier to make, and specialty coffee is more expensive for good environmental reasons, ecological reasons, and stuff like that. So will these post-capitalist / lower phase of communism economic system be able to accommodate through shadow price differences, for example, between specialty coffee, which can be grown in limited terroir, limited lands and stuff like that, and the regular coffee, which can be produced to much greater effect and therefore be cheaper, just easier to get. So yeah.
Yeah, Ante mentioned the term shadow price, and I'm happy to use the term shadow price. It's a technical term. It's got that word price. It's not a price. It has nothing to do with money and value. Okay, what it is it's a scarcity index. Something that has a higher price is more scarce. So it's a way of measuring scarcity, not natural scarcity, but scarcity in terms of what supply relative to demand. Yeah, I mean, I think that any advanced society has to take account of costs, and that's a complex issue. But certainly, is more labor involved in the production of specialty coffee. Probably there's other things more involved as well, maybe additional filtration, refrigeration, I don't know. But there's other things involved as well. I mean, if, for instance, people really like the specialty coffee, and you want to like say, well, my God, we don't want all of our social resources devoted to the production of this specialty coffee, you might want to increase the shadow price. In other words, to say, it's not a price. It's just saying if you want more specialty coffee, you're going to have to give up less. You're going to have to give up more of other things than you did before.
Okay, cool. And just
I'm not saying it has to be that way. I'm just saying, it could be this is one of these things that's not necessary. It's not impossible.
And one more thing with critique of the Gotha program. Did Marx actually claim that labor cost is the only thing that would be associated with the worth or the shadow price of the products in communism? Is that only labor cost? And we also talked about it, why only labor costs, or taking into account only labor needed to produce something, would be terrible, economically terrible, ecologically terrible way to go about it.
Right. Another way of putting this is, did Marx say that the cost of goods, products, to the person who withdraws means of consumption, would that cost be purely based on the amount of labor needed to produce those items? I don't think he said that. I know why people think he said it. He comes to this issue twice, at least once in the critique of the Gotha program, before that in volume 1 of Capital. There's other indications. He says a lot of things. Labor cost is very important. The allocation of labor is very important. I don't think he said that the cost assessment is purely based on the labor time needed to produce the things. And I think that if any society did that, it would be terrible. It would be a terrible thing to do, because the natural environment, well, there's a number of reasons, but one is that the natural environment doesn't take any labor to produce. It's there. It's a gift of nature. But if you say, well, it's costless, okay, that's the way the capitalists have been treating it for centuries, and we're in a very deep crisis.
Okay, I'm gonna skip the 12th question. We can maybe get back to it in Q&A session. I want to open up the floor for what I'm sure will be many other questions. So that's why I'm gonna stop now. Thank you so much for answering this, and hopefully other people will have many more things to say. Yeah.
Thank you both. I would suggest we have a 2-minute break, bathroom comfort break, and when we're all back, we'll hand over to Aidan for a second part. So please take a comfort break.
See you all at 2. I'll take over at 2, guys. Bathroom trip.
move myself over here to be closer to the modem, and that solved the problem. I'm going to go back and see how it works, because it's just so much more comfortable over there than sitting here. Is that what you were asking?
I don't know who was talking, but I have returned. I'll accept the chairing duty from Ralph. Thank you for chairing the first half of the meeting. And at this point, we'll be moving to opening the floor for questions for our discussants. I
And
see.
comments.
I'm sorry?
And comments.
And comments, right. Questions and comments for our discussions. And I see Andrew's unmuted. Ante, I'm going to ask you to unmute as well so that you can also engage in this second half of the discussion. And so I'm going to take Stack. So please raise your hand if you've got a question or comment for our discussants. And yeah, I see Ralph is on Stack. I see Nick Moore on Stack. Any others before I let them go ahead? Anyone else want to raise their hand and jump in? All right, so in the time being, Nick, I'm going to put you first on Stack. I'm going to ask you to unmute and go ahead. Ralph, you'll be next.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, you're
Can you
coming
hear
through.
me? That's
You're
good.
coming
Okay,
through.
yeah. Thanks for a really interesting lead off. I've got lots of questions, but the first one I'm going to start with is quite a technical one, and it's about the difference between directly social and indirectly social. I read Andrew's article that accompanied the thing, and in there, what you say is, when you're talking about the difference between directly social and indirectly social, he says they can be summed up by saying that an individual's labour qualifies as social labour only if and to the extent that it creates value. Now, I thought about that, and I thought about unproductive labour, and I thought that definition is insufficient, because unproductive labour doesn't create value. But I thought that unproductive labour should be social labour. It should be indirectly social labour. It's not going to be directly social labour. And I thought, so how can you extend the definition slightly? Surely indirectly social labour is always associated with money, whereas directly social labour will be connected with, in Marxist terms, labour certificates, right? And that's how I started to think about it, and I just wondered what Andrew thought about that.
Should I go?
Please go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Nick. I didn't think of that. I'm embarrassed. You're absolutely right. So yes, in capitalist society, lots of people, maybe half, do things that are not productive of value. They do work that's not productive of value, so-called unproductive labor. That labor is social labor, even though it's not creative of value. I'll have to do some thinking. Basically, my guess is that the way to explain what's going on is in terms of the ability of the business to appropriate some of the value, so that the act of unproductive labor would be connected with value in that way. Okay, so there's still going to be a connection with the amount of stuff that you're doing, and a connection with the value that the business, let's say it's a accounting firm. You're an accountant, you're working for an accounting firm. So it doesn't produce value, but the accounting firm is able to capture a portion of the surplus value that the producing capitalist, has pumped out of the workers, and that value connection matters. So I haven't phrased it. I mean, I'm hearing this for the first time, and it's flooring me because you're absolutely right. I should have seen this, and I just didn't. But I don't know if that is a satisfactory answer.
Nick, I just unmuted you there if you wanted to come in and
no, I agree with you. I agree with you, because when I first read what you wrote, I thought, yes, I agree with that. But because I've been doing some thinking about unproductive labor recently, I tried to fit that into it, and I thought the definition needs to be a bit broader. So it's basically
right. You're absolutely right.
It's the association with money, isn't it? That's because there's money's connection to value and all of that. That's the
money, value, and quantity of products.
Yeah.
And Ante, I just wanted to know if you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah. When it comes to unproductive labor, that's what was troubling me with administration costs and stuff that we already discussed. All of these things which are nowadays unproductive, but I think would absolutely be needed, like bureaucratic jobs of many different sorts. Yeah, I was thinking about those things as well, because I worked in some kind of bureaucratic, I mean, it's not something which wouldn't be called bureaucratic per se, but I was assisting people with their telephone issues, let's say. And these kinds of jobs are not productive for the operators, or however you call them, nowadays. But they need them to get customer satisfaction up. But something like that would absolutely be needed, maybe even in greater quantities in communism, especially given the abilities to actually produce physical stuff much more automatically through automatization and stuff like that. So this kind of mediating work, helping people out with the systems of many different sorts, these kinds of administrations of that sorts, and helping out and stuff like that, something which is not producing of different quantities of physical things or services which people need, but these kinds of middlemen of many different sorts. Yeah, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, because at least as I can see it, I think those kinds of jobs would increase in time. Some kinds of jobs of that sorts.
Ralph, I had you next on Stack. Anybody else wants to come up, please feel free to raise your hand. But Ralph, go ahead for now.
Yeah, I've also been thinking about how to measure the intensity of work. So that's what my thought process is like. For example, we measure the time it takes to drill one hole, or to tighten a screw. How much time does it take to tighten one screw? But my thinking on this is, as soon as we bring in an output measure, so the output measure being the hole being drilled, or the screw being tightened, then I think we would have to, well, that is again a productivity measure. So the ratio I had in mind here, how much time it takes to drill a hole, is hours divided by all holes drilled. So that gives you how much time it takes to drill one hole. But as soon as we bring in the output measure, we're back to productivity, and that's what we want to get away from or that Marx wanted to get away from. So I wanted to see, is my thinking correct on that? If it makes sense what I just said, of course. So to sum up, how much time does it take to drill one hole? So that would be time divided by one hole. So that is a productivity measure, isn't it?
Can I speak?
Please go ahead.
You're
The floor is yours.
okay. Yeah, I mean, you can measure the time that somebody takes, but then you say, well, how much work have they done? Well, you go, well, this person, did 4 times the number of drilled holes as the other one. Well, they've done 4 times as much work. No, not necessarily. Maybe they've done double as much work, and they got more sophisticated equipment, and so they're more productive. Or maybe one is just more skillful than the other. But the person who only did the one instead of the 4, they worked hard. It just didn't show up in terms of results. I think the basic thing deep down, at the gut level, in order to avoid like picture thinking here, is we've got to get beyond the mentality of other people being only a means to our satisfaction of what we want. So we've got to stop assessing other people's contributions to society in terms of the results for us. And I think that deep down, that is what is involved in Marx saying, it's the amount of work you do, number of hours, adjusted for intensity. That's the work you do. That's what will qualify as a contribution to social production. What we get from it, is the product in high demand, is a product that was previously considered, a high value product. Do you produce a lot of stuff? Those are all results for us. But we don't have to govern all of our social relations that way. Within a household, within a family, among friends, you don't do that. At least you don't do that all the time. And if you do, I don't want to be anywhere near you. A little kid draws you a picture, and gives it to you as a present. And you go, oh, well, like Picasso could do a lot better than that. Like, don't be like that.
Sometimes Picasso looked a little bit like it was drawn by a little kid. But Ralph, that was your question. I just wanted if you had any
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I have Theresa on Stack. Anybody else who wants to raise their hand and jump in on Stack? I have Mike on Stack. Ante, I didn't. Do you want to come in on Ralph's question before I go to anybody else on the list?
No, I think Andrew covered it all, yeah.
All right, so we have Theresa, Mike, Jimmy, and Nick again. All right, so we've got a healthy stack here. Theresa, go away. Go away. Go ahead. Don't go away. I'll go.
No. Okay. I have a question about the natural world and cost. I was interested to hear that. I mean, I guess I never thought about it. Like, what would the cost of natural world, if it's costless, that's how capitalists treat it, as if nature, resources, land, etc., are just there for the taking, to be consumed without any regard for sustainability or regeneration. So I guess my question is, does this imply that in the lower phase of communism, the natural world, land, resources, etc., would be part of the social consumption fund, in the sense that we would exchange our labor for access to those things, just as we would exchange our labor for access to other things in the social consumption fund? I'm interested to hear what both of you have to say about that, because it makes me think I think reading indigenous theorists from North America, I often come across a criticism or a rejection of Marxism, which I think is not a rejection of Marxism. Marxism is a conflation of Marxism with Stalinism mostly. But their rejection often is that the Marxism, socialism, communism would be exploitative relationship to the land, natural resources, etc. But in this conception, that seems to not be the case. In fact, it seems we'd be getting away from that land is just there for the taking relationship we have, this like relationship of domination in capitalist society. We would be moving away to a, oh, this is a thing that is like essential to our lives, and we can't, it's not just there for the taking. In fact, we have to like do something to gain access to it. And I actually think this is more complementary to the kind of pre-colonial and economic systems and the like resurgent worldviews and philosophies of at least the Anishinaabe people on the lands that I live on, who would talk about it like being from the land, and that there's not like a, you don't go there and just take more than you need and whatever, it's going to grow back, who cares. It's like a real like you tend to the land because the land tends to you. And it seems like this kind of arrangement or relationship would be actually more possible if land wasn't so-called costless, if we saw it as something that was part of the social consumption fund. But I just wanted to know what you two thought of that, or anyone else.
All right, that's for our discussants.
I'll go.
I mean, I would definitely agree with you, and especially with this thing that the cost of products would actually have to take into account all the negative externalities with pollution and stuff like that. Because of that, these shadow prices would be able to reflect the cost on the nature, not just labor cost on people who had to make something. And if you have this shadow price, or if you have this, whatever we want to call it, let's just simplify now and call it shadow price, this scarcity index, it's not only, I mean, it doesn't have to be only about scarcity, it can also be about all the negative externalities, ecological problems, carbon footprint and stuff like that. And if you have a good way to collate all of those informations together and have it reflected in this shadow price, then things that are polluting more, or things that are bad for the environment, or for example, eating meat and stuff like that, would just be much more expensive than some other things. Again, expensive in this sense of having a higher shadow price. And in this way, people would be disincentivized from consuming too much meat, for example, because of all the bad things connected with it. Especially, I mean, just the killing of different species is bad enough, but then also all the big problems with ecological catastrophe and how meat industry is bringing that about with the accelerated pace. So yeah, that would be my short response to that.
Yeah, I mean, Marx did not talk much about this. He was aware, actually painfully aware of some of this stuff like soil depletion. And he talked about the interchange of people and the rest of nature, as like a reciprocal relationship. There's metabolism that has to be maintained. That was his analogy. He was not given to writing recipes for the cook shops of the future. So he didn't like specify, it's going to look like this. It's got to be this way, not some other way. And the only other thing I'll say is, this has been an issue on the minds of a lot of people, a lot of well-meaning economists. They've worked out a lot of stuff about how to internalize externalities with regard to pollution. It's called an external cost because the capitalists don't pay it. It's an actual cost, but they count it as zero to the extent that they don't have to pay it. And that's one way of understanding the crisis that we're in, that they don't have to pay the cost. So it remains external to them. But I don't see how the capitalist system is going to be able to maintain civilized life for much longer. And I think, a transformation of society into socialism is going to be on the order of the day. Hopefully not, it'll happen before it's too late, because with a socialist society, you can overcome these problems because you don't have this imperative to expand value to the utmost. Minimize your costs, maximize your output, maximize the accumulation of value. You won't have that imperative if we can get rid of, all the capitalist requirements and laws of capitalism, and that will make a solution to the environmental crisis possible.
I'm gonna move us along just because we had a couple more on stack. But Theresa, please feel free to jump back on stack if you feel like there's follow-up there. But anyway, I believe I saw Michael next. So Mike, let me unmute you and go ahead.
Thanks, Gabriel. And thank you for Ante for very clear intro and questions. The thing that breaks my brain the most is the directly social labor and what Andrew was sort of just articulating about people are not a means to an end in this case in terms of like the productive society's productive like pie, so to speak, and how that jives with is in relation with specialization and how two people working in good faith for an hour, whether they be a neurosurgeon or a father of two kids or somebody putting together t-shirts or whatever, is it's hard to conceptualize, but at the end of it, it seemed like it's an ethic, and so I'm just wondering about what everybody's thoughts were about what's the basis of that ethic. Is it a humanism that says that our contributions are not to be measured by what the final product is? Anything about the philosophy of it, because I feel like we could that'll still be mind bending, but I feel like consumption and the way that things are tracked and all that stuff, I can imagine a world where we get to that, but it's a whole different ethic that needs to be enacted in practice. Over.
I'll leave that one for the discussants, either of you to jump in on.
I said, do you want to take it?
I can. I mean, when it comes to the intensity, I think the most important thing is for us to just really see, for example, with air traffic control, people doing that kind of work really shouldn't be working hours which are like more than 20 or 30 a week. Just we can definitely assess with these kinds of jobs how much work you can actually do before it stops being safe for everyone involved. And these kinds of jobs where so many people's lives depend on you are incredibly intense just by the dint of so many people depending on you. It's not the same if you're driving a car just for yourself or if you're a bus driver and then so many people again depend on you. You shouldn't be able to drive as many hours as you would if you were driving just for yourself. So all these kinds of things which would be as some kind of humanist ethics, but something which we can really work through and see. Obviously, that's the job to be done and to be done with much greater precision and detail. But I think that this common sense logic of some work just shouldn't be done for as much hours as some other work, but it absolutely has to be done, and it's incredibly worthwhile. Then these kinds of jobs cannot just be if you work 20 hours. It's like you work 20 hours and you can get consumption rights for 20 hours worth of whatever. It should be much more because of that. But how to actually calculate this? It will take a tremendous effort, but it doesn't seem to me to be completely unsurpassable. And obviously, people who maybe bicker around who has more intense job in this or that way But I think that some reasonable scale of it can be assessed, can be worked through. It would be political decision, obviously, and it could be reworked for some other things in the future. But I think people can get together and actually agree on many of these basics. At least that's my hope.
Let me just say a couple of things. I mean, I'm not a philosopher. I'm not an ethicist. I mean, yes, this is an ethical issue. That does not mean that the way to socialism is to advocate an ethic and get agreement. Because, I mean, look, even people who are capitalists can agree, but when it's to their advantage, they make an exception for themselves. And we live that kind of life where everybody does that. My strong suspicion is that this ethic is not just, some free-floating thing, but is grounded in the nature of human beings the nature of what human beings are as the social species. I don't know anybody who likes to be thought of or treated just as a means by other people. And, most people can get beyond that when they're engaged in social relations that allow them to get beyond it. The big problem is, people apply one set of standards to their immediate family, maybe friends, and then, maybe the nation state. But the idea of thinking of a human community it's still not as natural to people. Yeah, I mean, I don't have very sophisticated thoughts about this, but I was trying to get at, because I wrote something about this very recently. Like, you don't have to assess people's contributions in terms of the results. I was trying to get at what people find very, very hard, which is to understand how the lower phase of communist society differs from capitalist society, because it's not, each according to their ability, each according to their needs, and you can do whatever you want, whenever you want, and criticize after dinner, and smoke dope in the morning, tend the sheep, those fantasies. It's not like that. People have to work. They're assessed in accordance with the amount of work they do. But that's not what goes on in capitalism. And it's just to be able to clarify what else is going on in capitalism, how it's different, that we're measuring people's contributions in terms of what they can give us. And I think that might, set off some bells in people's heads.
Gentlemen, we're good with me moving on? All right. Jimmy, I had you next on stack, so please go ahead.
Thank you. I was hoping to just change the way slightly that we're thinking about some of the questions that have already been raised, or some of the difficulties. And I just want to preface my comment by saying that often critics of Marx's critique of the Gotha program, or post-Marx Marxists who downplay it, they occasionally make light of the differences between labor notes a la Marx and money. And sometimes the way that we talk about this issue accidentally can reinforce this. And so my main point I wanted to make is how much it necessarily changes the answers to all these questions when we remember that the aspect of directly social labor, that means that not just your contribution, but also your compensation has to be counted in terms of labor and not in terms of stuff. And I think also this goes to the heart of some of the challenges people have with accepting this stuff that Andrew was just talking about. I think that, we keep talking about how your contribution is counted. Often that doesn't land with, I think, what way people conceptualize this issue is incentives. Like we really have to be talking about a society with a different ethic, because it's not the same incentive if you're saying, Andrew was talking earlier about exchange between of the individual and society. The individual gives their labor, and in return they receive just consumption. They don't exchange products, but the important thing that I want to add to that or highlight is it's an exchange where what you contribute is your labor, and in return you are entitled to consumption of labor, consumption of a certain amount of labor, not a certain amount of stuff. And that means that has implications for all of the issues we've been raising, like the issue of the natural resources. I think it's a really good point to bring into these questions about negative externalities and internalizing them, or dealing with the metabolism. But all of it is complicated when you can't promise anybody a certain amount of stuff. You can only promise that somebody's going to do a certain amount of labor for them in return for their labor. For example, the natural resources. Yeah, people could address this in the common plan by raising the scarcity index or the shadow price, as Andrew was saying, of things that intensively use natural resources. But there's an issue here, though. That shadow price, if you raise the shadow price and people still want to use the thing, they're gonna then go out and do even more labor so that they earn even more labor notes, and then they can pay, and they're still using the natural resources. Also, the shadow price also, in a sense, though, it works better than maybe it would under capitalism. In capitalism, you can charge people more. You can do like a gas tax kind of thing, but the richer you are, the less that means for you. In socialism, a small change in shadow price would essentially affect everybody equally, because it means that you need to literally do more work if you want one of those things, even though one of those things, it actually was produced with just a normal amount of labor. You have to do even more labor than that if you want it, no matter who you are. But there's another whole way that people could deal with these negative externalities, this metabolism. Besides that, I think it better aligns with the spirit of society with transparent social relations, is they can just directly, when they plan production, they can put limits on certain labor processes. And they can basically just say there's a quota, we'll produce this many, video games, but because they use, rare earths in them, and we're just going to have you can produce as many as you want, no more. So you can have a system where the going rate for products that intensively use the earth is higher. You can have a system where there's just a limited quota of them that are allowed to be made in the plan. You can have a situation where both things apply. But with to Ralph's point, it's not as soon as we measure productivity, it's as soon as we use a measure of productivity to define your compensation. And so, like, we're promising people a certain amount of labor and not a certain amount of stuff. That doesn't mean that we can't measure how much you produce and use that to plan. It just means that we're not only not defining how much you contribute, but what you can buy with that labor note depends on how much labor it actually took. If tomatoes have a bad season, then they're going to cost more labor per tomatoes. And so there's I think there's just a problematic here to deal with both of the answers that have been mentioned, to compensating the different intensity of labor, like this night security guard versus airplane controller issue, and compensating the difference in intensity of resource use, which is really a similar issue, kind of works in reverse. If you want to consume something that maybe doesn't require a lot of labor, but it does burn a lot of natural resources, compensating that. The complication in both senses is that you're pricing things in terms of labor. And so, for example, you can pay the shadow price with more late by doing more work, which kind of defeats the purpose, because now we're being more intensive on using the earth in order to pay our tax for being intensive on using the earth. And then if you're compensating the airline controllers more, you have to keep in mind that you're telling them, yeah, you're going to earn more, but you're going to earn more labor, not more stuff necessarily. So I hope you can see why that's problematic, and that needs to be, I think people will think of that in terms of, well, what's the incentive to me to be an airline controller? Finally, well, there's another issue. I think I'll consider making another comment if it comes up later. That's all.
Gabriel?
Yes.
Yeah, I got a number of things to say in response. First of all these words, kind of like bother me. And I understand we don't have alternative language, but the whole idea of compensate, it's too much like an exchange relationship. I think to get at what we're trying to theorize here. At least we're not talking about being paid, which means that's a money exchange. But people don't consume labor. So literally speaking, that's not what you mean. I think what you meant to say, Jim, is that people cannot be guaranteed a certain amount of products. And I think that's right. But I also don't think that the measure of the cost of the products has to be in terms of the amount of labor that it takes to produce them. Not that solely. Okay, because first of all, if it were that solely, then we would be, saying that the cost of using up natural resources is zero because they're, a gift of nature, at least the first time around. Okay, so I don't want to put it in those terms either. I think what the real issue is this. There's a total cost of the total social product. And part of that total social product is available for individual consumption. And let's say there's 1 million labor years of work that are done, and you've done 1 labor year of work out of that 1 million. Then you're entitled to 1/1,000,000th of the total cost, of the means of consumption available for individual consumption. So if the means of consumption available for individual consumption, is 10 million, whatever's, you're entitled to 10. Let me just say a word on this idea of people wanting some thing that they really like that's got a high, quote, shadow price, close quote, and they're going to want to work themselves into the ground, so that they can get additional rights to consume, so they can get this stuff. Well, first of all, that has limits. I mean, I don't know how many people are going to want to push themselves, 80 hours a week for more than a couple of weeks. But secondly, there's going to be limits to anybody's ability to do this, because to the extent that you're working, you're not just working, you're first of all working with other people. Second of all, it's using up society's means of production. You can't just decide that you're going to use up society's means of production. So at a certain point, it's going to be like we either have a need for, the work, or we don't have a need for the work. And if we don't have a need for the work, then, you get some free time. But nobody can like individually command, society to give it that person resources so that they can do more work. That's not a cooperative society.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, there are always additional consumption, right? I mean, for example, you cannot just buy and buy and buy laptops. At some point, they will say you already bought 5 this year or whatever. Bought is not the right term, obviously, but you cannot get consumption rights for one particular kind of product, especially if it has high shadow price, because just at one point it's just as a society, given it will be planned economy and everything else, you can put limitations on that, and limitations which will not be onerous. It will just make sense, and it will be something of a political decision that we say, okay, you can buy this many of this or that. As a society-wide level, we can agree on that, and then you have your own labor certificates / consumption rights, and you see, for example, in app or wherever, how many of some kinds of things you can buy in this year, and for example you can just buy 5 of this or 10 of that, and that's it. In that sense, again, you will be disincentivized from trying to work as much as possible to just get something which is very bad for the environment, but you want it. And obviously, I agree with you when you said that we can plan in advance and agree that we're not going to produce, for example, as much meat, just because it's too bad for many different ecological and ethical reasons. And then the shadow price of meat, of beef or whatever, would be very high. And then people will sometimes take it and decide to have it, but they wouldn't be able to do it all the time. And they wouldn't be able to work more somewhere else just to buy so much additional beef. It would just be, something you cannot do more than X amount, which would be agreed upon. So I think that solution would make sense and wouldn't run into additional problems. At least I hope so. Yeah.
There was on Stack, I see Mike has his hand raised. Nick had his hand raised before. Both of you asked a question again, and you're on Stack. I got you for this time, but I wanted to ask if anybody who hasn't said anything would like to come in at this time and raise your hand. If you do, I'll jump you to the head of the stack, and you can go first. So going once, going twice. Anybody want to raise their hand that hasn't gone? And look at that. I'm raising my hand. I haven't gone. So I'll let myself jump to the top of the stack with a quick one that I just wanted to get in before we go to Nick and then Mike. Mine has to do with the working out of these questions that we're doing here. And there's obviously some active working still happening in the conversation, and I think even maybe disagreements between some participants on how worked out it is. And I think of something Andrew wrote in a piece many years ago, and maybe he remembers the title, but it escapes me at this time, about the need to think about the post-capitalist organization, and without, as you guys discussed, making recipes for the future, because capitalism falls the next day, the counter-revolutionaries are at the gate and people have to eat day one. So you have to have it figured out how you're going to do that. And I wanted to ask you where do you see between where we are right now and our understanding of the lower phase of communism and the economics of it, which is how we advertise this meeting, and where we need to be if, day one happens next week? Because something I keep coming back to is thinking like, we're not there yet. We haven't, even those of us who consider ourselves as socialists or quote unquote socialist intellectuals or worker intellectuals, or however we want to conceive of ourselves in thinking on these questions, I don't think we're anywhere near where we need to be on that work to kind of, I don't know, hit the ground running in our understanding. I think there's a lot of distance between where we are now and there. I wanted to ask that, and I also wanted to ask, what do you think are the pressing questions still that we need to consider? Over.
Go for it, Ante.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely agree that we don't have things worked out as much as we would have to and would need to. These things with shadow prices, scarcity indexes, how to figure those things out. Andrew mentioned some of the economists already did some stuff on internalizing externalities. So this is definitely something that's already thankfully happening in many different corners. That kind of work should be integrated. Plus, this talking about different intensities of different jobs and how to assess that, obviously that will have to be done. So many different things have to be done, but if we have right conceptual framework, which Andrew is working on through his reading of Marx, I think we would be on a right path to actually approach these different people who are trying to make these plans as well, and to give them some Marxist insight that would be of great help. So in this sense, I think we are on the right path, but obviously we are far from being there. But many of these different things is something that we can work on. I don't think it's an impossible thing to have done once we understand things like why the work has to be directly social labor and stuff like that. Once we understand these conceptual things which are in Marx, but which we really have to grapple with. If we understand that, I think then we can actually integrate many different things that people are already working on, but like these basic tenets which would enable them to become truly viable. And then we have a good edifice to build upon, and good things to potentially implement in some better, brighter future.
Yeah, I also think that we are very far from what we need to be, and I think that Gabriel outlined where we need to be exactly right. Because the counter-revolution is going to be, right there. And if we can't get food on the table for ourselves, they're going to step in, and worse than that, like what if that fails and we still fail to get the food on the table? What's going to happen to society then? And I got into all of this stuff over 20 years ago, and I heard like these well-meaning people from the Socialist Labor Party and similar formations milieu, and it was just all of this unrealistic stuff about you decide, that's what socialism is. You decide, and all these intricate plans regarding, political decision making essentially applied to economic matters, but it's still politics. It's still political determinism. And then in news and letters committees, you had people extolling experimentation. And I'm like, what the hell are you people talking about? There's not going to be time for experimentation. If you have to experiment, I mean, are people going to be able to eat in the meantime? And so I think the piece that Gabriel might be referring to that I wrote, I think it was called "Let's Get Real," because that was like what was on my mind. It never has left. It's let's get real about these things, and I think you get a sense of Marx's realism when he takes like something like really mundane and pedantic about this like undiminished proceeds of labor. He says, look, you want to talk about this realistically, let's look at all the things that got to be deducted before you can talk about the means of consumption that are available to individuals. So let's just make clear that you're just talking a lot of ideological hot air. But we're very far from that. I think we're very far from acceptance by the general radical movement, revolutionary movement Marxists, that we have to work out these questions. because you always get, that's blueprints, that's recipes for the cook shops of the future. What I'm trying to make clear is it doesn't have to be, and it wasn't that way with Marx. It doesn't mean, avoidance of blueprints does not mean silence or, putting false hopes in experimentation and, people becoming totally different than people have been for millions of years the moment you have a change in political power. I'm not going to put my faith in that. So we got a lot of stuff to do to overcome that. On the other hand, we got there's evidently a new book coming out called The Blueprint by some people associated with Jacobin. They're giving us another blueprint. Thank you very much. We don't need that either. Even if it would work, which it's not going to. But what we really need, I think, to work on conceptually beyond that is how to have a society in which the imperative to create unlimited amounts of abstract wealth is no longer dominating our lives, because that's the purpose of all of capitalist production, is the never-ending expansion of wealth in the abstract. That's what value is, wealth in the abstract. How can we have a society that works according to different principles? I mean, people say, well, produce for needs. And yeah, that's right. But what has to be changed to make that possible? Okay. And how do we move from a society in which people's contributions are measured and assessed according to how much stuff they give us and how valuable it is, to a society where your contribution is assessed in terms of how much work you do? And then in a higher phase of communism, we can talk about from each according to their ability to each according to their need. But, right here and now, we can't have that. Right here and now, we need a socialist society. We need to move beyond capitalism before it's too late. And so what we need is a society where, yeah, you have to work in order to get, means of consumption. But how do we move away from assessing individual contributions according to how much stuff you produce? And, for the most part, that has nothing to do with individuals, but has to do with the means of production available to them. I just, a couple of weeks ago, I crunched some numbers. The labor productivity of rice production, producing rice in the United States, is more than 100 times that of Indonesia. Okay, rice producers in the U.S. are 100-fold as productive as rice producers in Indonesia. That doesn't mean that, it's certainly not 100 times the intensity. It has to do with more sophisticated equipment, maybe better irrigation, more sophisticated fertilizer, and so forth. How do we move away from a situation where all of that matters? Well, one way is to move beyond this imperative to self-expand abstract wealth. Okay, but I think we got to get our thinking in those kinds of terms.
We have 7 minutes remaining in this conversation, and we have 2 people on stack. So I'd just like to ask that we be mindful of time. If stack rose, I can make a motion on the floor to extend our conversation. But as right now, let's just see if we can get through the next 2 I have on stack. So that's you, Nick, first, and then Mike. So go ahead, Nick.
Okay, thanks. I might try and squeeze in more than one question then. When Marx talks about the lower phase of communism, my understanding of it is it's an end to commodity production, right? That is such a profound change from what we're used to. Marx called capitalism. I think, well, how do we end commodity production? And maybe the key to it is labor certificates. because my understanding of it, and I went back to the Gotha program and I couldn't find if Marx says this. When you exchange a labor certificate, say it's worth 50 hours, and you exchange it for some consumption goods, that labor certificate is then destroyed. Okay, it no longer exists. It's like a theatre ticket. You're using it up. And if you have and it doesn't matter whether it's electronic or whether it's a bit of paper or whatever it is, if it's destroyed, if it no longer exists, isn't that an end of commodity production, right? So the key mechanism, and if you're rewarded, if workers are getting paid, I use the word paid in terms of their contribution, their labour contribution, then that's in terms of labour certificates. When that's exchanged for consumption goods, that level. So did Marx say that? I couldn't actually find that he said it's destroyed, but I think that's probably a key part of it, because that would indicate a move away from the production of commodities. And secondly, would these labour certificates be individual, or could they be transferred to other people? For example, if I worked and got some labour certificates, I'd quite like to transfer them to my daughter, maybe, to purchase some things that she likes. But the key thing is, when they're used up, they're destroyed. So I would be able to transfer my own labour certificates to somebody else. It still wouldn't mean we're back to commodity production. So that's my main question. If I can just squeeze in another one, is there a difference between common ownership and held in common? I tend to not like the word ownership, because if you have ownership, it almost seems to imply that ownership can be transferred. So I like the term held in common, but what does it actually mean, held in common? You know, what does it mean, common ownership? Stuff that can't be, not owned by the state, but stuff that can't be transferred between institutions or people. That's it. Thanks.
I'll leave that's one for the discussants for the time being.
We have another person on stack.
We do. We have Mike.
Why don't we take that and then we can assess what we have in terms of time.
All right, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask quickly what are some of the, besides Marx, who were some of the antecedents who were really focused on this, in your estimations, people that you're drawing on or in dialogue with, not Jacobin, and and I know that there are other ultra left or left-com anti-Stalinist, basically leftists, who are dealing with what comes after and what Marx's vision of communism was. So I don't know if this is a cyclical thing, but people are writing about it for whatever reason. Who are people, maybe Donetskaya as well, who are really grappling with these issues, as far as you can see? Thanks.
Ante, do you want to take it, or should I, or whatever? Actually, I think we're done, so we have to give it over to the chair.
Yeah, we're just about to hit time now, so I wanted to ask if put out a motion on the floor. Anyone would like to put out a motion to extend the meeting by perhaps 10 minutes and continue the conversation? Anyone like to raise their hand and send the motion? Anybody has any burning questions or would like to hear the discussants wrap up? All right, we've got it from Nick there. Andrew, that works for you?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know how we can actually do a voice vote with everybody muted. So,
You can use your prerogative as chair.
all right, I use the chair prerogative. I'll extend us for this time for 5 minutes. I'll move it to the discussants, and we'll take it from there. Go ahead.
I'll just answer the part that Nick asked and that Andrew and I already talked about when it comes to the lifespan of the labor notes, labor certificates, consumption rights, how we want to call it. It was a discussion about that, but yeah, it would just expire just like a theater ticket. Once I did the work, I get these labor certificates, I get something with it, and that's it. Nothing else happens for these businesses, for example, that provided me with something, with service or good, except that they know that someone took it and, accounting purposes, but nothing else. At least my understanding of it would be like that. And when it comes to the transferability of it or not, we talked about that as well, because for you to, I was thinking the other way around. It would be all right for you to buy something and give it to someone else. So, for example, you would be able to buy something, for example, women's clothes, even though you don't wear them yourself, or not even that, smaller size of shoes, even though you obviously can't wear them, but you give it to someone else, and that's not something which would be not allowed because that's not something that you can wear or stuff like that. It would just be a gift you give to someone, but that's it. And it would be very problematic if we would enter into all of these gift-giving problems and relations and stuff like that. So it's all right for you to buy some things and give it to someone else, but maybe, at least to my understanding, that would be the extent of it. So you wouldn't be banned from acquiring shoes which are too small for you. And for example, we know by statistics your shoe size and stuff like that. But that would be something that you buy that you get as a gift, and that's it. But yeah, that's at least my understanding of it when it comes to these questions. Andrew, if you want to come in, yeah.
Yeah, on to Mike's question. I mean, Marx's work to me is like really important. I keep getting things, nuances that I didn't get before, on rereadings. So I spend a lot of time with that. The reason that Marx's work matters so much, I think, is that he was in very direct dialogue with a lot of people who we would think that he is very similar to. And this is among the reasons why everybody thinks Marx was nasty and overbearing, is because, he was saying the same thing as everybody else, but he had to have it his way. Well, he was very aware that they all shared the same goals, but what he was dealing with was what's possible, what's not possible, what's necessary, and he thought that they didn't get that. So what he was trying to do was to help out everybody, by making it on a more scientific basis. And he provides a lot that way. I think Dunayevskaya provides a lot of help to me on many, many matters, particularly understanding the class nature of all value relations. She didn't have much to say about, the lower phase of communist society as such. And there's reasons why I think she didn't. And so, I think that there's problems with the participatory economics of Albert and Hanel. But I think that at least when they wrote their initial works, they were focused on the right kinds of problems, or some of the right kinds of problems. I think they did good things, and that's a basis. I don't spend a lot of time, reading other people these days. I don't do that systematically or regularly. It tends to be when somebody brings something to my attention, because I'm busy, like, I'm looking at the clock for when I'm going to die, and I'm not sure, because it could be like 1 year, it could be 30 years, but I got to get this book of mine finished. So I'm concerned with that. So I don't spend a lot of time, reading other people systematically. one can say that the properties of the certificates are the key to everything, but I'm really trying to get away from that. There's nothing magical about the certificates. They are just a means of verifying that one has an entitlement to means of consumption by virtue of having worked. Just like a theater ticket is a way of verifying that one has a right to enter the theater by virtue of having forked over money. And, as you said, Nick, doesn't have to be a paper certificate. It can be, a database that just keeps track of things. It's just like a gift card. There's no magic in the fact that you use up your gift card and that's it. That's all that's really going on with the labor certificates. You acquire certain consumption rights by virtue of having worked instead of by virtue of paying. You're entitled to consumption. When you've used up those consumption rights, you either work more, or if you don't, then that's it. I don't think that the qualities of the verification system are the way of ensuring that we're going to have a socialist society that really is not just another form of capitalism, or that just does not revert to capitalism. What's going to be crucial is to work out new social relations such that if you work, you are entitled to the appropriate means of consumption. Okay, it's that relationship that I think is key. And however we can make that happen, yeah, but I don't think that you use up your gift card. That kind of thinking is going to get us very far.
Any other comments from our discussants? All righty then. Oh, one last remark on the floor. I got you, Nick.
Yeah, I was sort of assuming that there were new social relations, and on the basis of those new social relations, which would be, workers' controlled, democratic, this, that, and the other, plus other things, which is I don't think they're talked about. I mean, money is not very often talked about when we talk about revolutionary change in society, and workers taking control of the factories, taking control of production. You need to go further than that, because if money's still there, you've not really got rid of capitalism. And therefore, with new relations of production, I suppose it's what Andrew is saying. What are the new relations of production, which then allows a new distribution to take place, a new distribution that can take place on the basis of something like labor certificates, which is not commodity production. So that's I was in the discussion, I was almost assuming there are new relations of production, because we've mainly discussed about how distribution would take place in the lower phase of a communist society, rather than what are the new relations of the production which would allow that new form of distribution to take place. And it's the new relations of production, which, as Andrew said, which are more important than the actual, which will determine actually what kind of distribution you can have. You can have. And if we get the relations of production, the change in the relations of production right, then the way things are distributed will follow from it. Well, at least that's how I understand it.
All right, so at this point in the discussion, I'm supposed to hand over the chair to Theresa, but she had to step out. So that's me closing the meeting then. I want to thank Ante for joining us today, and I want to thank everyone for taking part. And Ralph, I saw you on mute. Is there any other bits of business we need to get to before I close it up?
No, I was just getting ready to say great meeting. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, see you next time.
All right. We'll all be in touch. And hold on one second. Let's not scatter yet. Go ahead, Anne.
You're muted.
Okay. Yeah, I don't want the last word to be on distribution. I'm sorry, Nick, but the whole point is Marx was not fixed on distribution the way today's redistributed left is. It was on the relations at the point of production and creating new human relations. And I think that's still our goal, and that distribution will follow from that. And it's not where we start. It's sort of a byproduct of a new way of working and a new way of living. So I just wanted to end on that note. Over.
I think it's a great note done. All right, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ante.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Ante.
Thank you,
Andrew.
thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Theresa.
All right.
Yes, thank you, Ante, for the
Thank
questions
you.
too.
But
The questions were good.